today, the CFPB rescinds 67 guidance documents. Now, I had talked in that previous video about how of late, the CFPB under Rohit Chopra, hope I'm saying that right, the previous administrator, under his leadership, he was appointed by the Biden administration, had given a lot of these guidance documents. Matter of fact, there was 67 guidance documents that were rescinded today, and 64 of them came under, his leadership. And so he used these guidance documents a lot to set policy. Now, a lot of people saw that as helpful. Matter of fact, I did. I'm like, it's nice to have some clarity from the CFPB on what their expectations are. But as I was reading this article, as I got more of the details, it turns out Trump had actually signed in 2019 an executive order that agencies should not create rights or obligations through guidance documents. So there was this previous order from the Trump administration, previous term, that said agencies shouldn't do that, and CFPB being one of those agencies that shouldn't do that. However, that was repealed by the Biden administration. And so under Chopra, we saw a lot of these guidance documents comes out. Now, I thought it was interesting that both the American Bankers Association and the Mortgage Bankers Association both were in favor of them repealing these 67 guidance documents. And I'm like, well, I wonder why they would be supportive of that. And basically the feedback is that oftentimes the CFPB would adopt interpretations that are inconsistent with statutory text and impose compliance burdens on mortgage companies, banks, etc. And so I think that's interesting that, and keep in mind, the ABA, the American Bankers Association, they're regulated by a lot of different entities. It's not just the CFPB. Everyone knows that the banks also have to deal with the OTC and FDIC and all these different regulators that the banks deal with. And so when you have this overarching guidance from the CFPB, sometimes, and this makes sense, they might take a little bit different interpretation than other regulatory entities. And so it creates a lot of confusion for banks that are trying to adhere to what the CFPB has said, if it might be different. And just like in the mortgage industry, we deal with a lot of state regulators. Well, it's oftentimes that the CFPB would give out these guidance documents. So at least we know where the CFPB stands, but it doesn't always align with state regulators and so on and so forth. And so, when I read that, I could kind of see why this makes sense. Now, they did not say that this would be a permanent repeal of these guidance documents. It's possible that some of them get reinstated. It's possible they get rewritten or clarified, and maybe many of them just, go away completely. But it is interesting because now there are some items, many of which are around, credit reporting. There's some around loan officer compensation. There's different guidance documents that had previously been looked at by many companies and many compliance departments as, okay, now we have clarity on what the CFPB wants to see. And now that clarity is gone. Now, that also happens at a time where does not look like the CFPB is doing a whole lot of enforcement either. And so, it kind of leaves people in an interesting place to then interpret for themselves what it is the CFPB is looking for. But anyway, this is just more on this story that I wanted to share with you guys. And it is creating some confusion. So don't be surprised if, some companies might say, well, that guidance document is no longer in effect. So maybe this policy that we wrote based on that, maybe we feel open to changing that, right? So we might see some of that stuff happen in our industry.